they're questioning the suggestion that this is a story of human people, that there's a kind of frowning of the idea that a captain's choices could be questioned, that his absolute authority should somehow be even challenged, is so far from where we would hope people would have got to fairly quickly. It is just a reminder, a very brutal and chilling reminder of what the moral compass is at the time.
Welcome to History's Greatest Scandals. In this series, we're uncovering the secrets of the Georgian era. And joining me to explore the highs and lows of British society in the 18th and early 19th centuries is Professor Hannah Greig, a historian, author, and a historical consultant on dramas including Poldark, The Favourite, and Bridgerton. We'll be following on the trail of forgers, uncovering illicit liaisons, meeting cross-dressing celebrity spies, and getting involved in some high-stakes gambling, as we search out some of the biggest scandals of the day and explore what they can reveal about the Georgian age.
So today we've got a very dark story, actually, very different in tone to the other stories we've been talking about for this series. And it's one that exposes a really rotten core at the centre of the Georgian Britain's economy, which is the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade.
And is it fair to call the story that we're going to discuss today a scandal, do you think?
Well, it's definitely a scandal in terms of being shocking, shocking to society at the time and shocking to us now. So let's get into it and you can decide for yourself. But before we do, I think we should just say that this episode does contain distressing content from the start. So we're in 1781 for this story, and a British-owned ship called Zong has just left Accra on the Gold Coast, which is modern-day Ghana, and it's heading for Jamaica. The ship is captained by a ship surgeon named Luke Collingwood on behalf of the Gregsons, who are owners who are based in Liverpool. On board, alongside a fairly small crew, the Zong carries 442 enslaved people.
So that's a huge amount of people on one ship.
Yes, a huge number of people in a relatively small space, and actually about twice as many as it was actually designed to carry. Now, once the ship enters the waters of Jamaica, things begin to go wrong. After navigational errors had left it stranded quite far from its intended destination, it was unable to move without any wind. It's becalmed in the seas, and supplies on the ships begin to dwindle. The crew later claim that they'd begun to run out of drinking water at this moment, so an absolutely critical element of the ship's supplies. By this point, around 60 of the enslaved Africans on board had already died of illness and sickness, and it appeared that illness might be spreading across the ship. Captain Collingwood himself had succumbed to some kind of sickness, and it was in this situation that the ship's crew then made a really horrifying decision.
So we have quite a desperate situation here, but I have a feeling things are about to get worse.
Yes, allegedly a desperate situation. So with Collingwood, the captain, confined to his sickbed, it's not quite clear who made the decisions about what should happen next. But what we do know is that over the course of 3 days, between the 29th of November and the 1st of December, the crew carried out a series of mass killings, ultimately throwing somewhere in the region of 123 enslaved people overboard to their deaths at sea. A further 10 people died by suicide, throwing themselves overboard during this period of what must have been absolute horror on board the ship.
So we've got a death toll there of more than 130 people. For those who remained on board afterwards, what happened? Did they survive the rest of the journey?
The Zong does arrive at its intended destination in Jamaica, and the remaining 208 enslaved people still on board were sold into the island's plantation system. Now, the ship's log, which was intended to record all of the events of the journey, including those difficult circumstances the ship had encountered off the coast of Jamaica, mysteriously disappears.
Okay, let's take a breather for a moment from the story to get a bit more context on what's quite a shocking event. Can you tell us more about the transatlantic slave trade in general in the era of the Zong?
Yes, I mean, so the trade actually forms a really crucial part of Britain's economy in the 18th century. Britain already begun to emerge as the biggest trader in the world. And what was happening, as I think most people are aware, is there's an exploitation of a triangular trade route where ships set out from England, so from the big ports like Liverpool and Bristol, and also smaller ports like Plymouth and others around the country. And they set out carrying European goods for trade abroad. So particularly actually firearms are very lucrative as a form of cargo to carry from England, and they go to Africa first. They offload that first cargo, making a profit on that ship's journey. And then at that point, they then reload with a new cargo. This time, the cargo is that of enslaved people who are then carried across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, and they are taken and sold in Jamaica. There, the ships then pick up sugar and tobacco and rum and other products associated with those plantations and other produce for import before they return at home again to Britain. Now, between 1726 and 1800, it's estimated that British ships are actually responsible for taking more than 2 million people from Africa to the Americas and are responsible for about 40% of all enslaved traffic around the world across the course of the century. So it is, Britain is right at the centre of this trade.
So you've given us a really good rundown there of the logistics of the trade, the numbers, the statistics involved. But what about the emotional landscape that we're missing here? Can you give us a sense of what it would have been like to be on that Middle Passage journey?
Well, I think there's no other way of presenting it other than completely horrific. I mean, we're talking about the enforced movement of people against their will around the world. But also, we know that the conditions on these ships are not in any way comfortable or pleasant. People are not treated with any degree of regard for human life. They are considered to be a cargo, and that comes with it some really kind of brutal experiences. We know that ships often carried far more people than they should, as the case of the Zong. Men and women and children often separated, so men were kept apart from women and children. Men in particular were kept in a way that was intended to prevent them causing any distress or disruption. It was considered to be a kind of containment policy almost. It's just often shackled, just carried brutally across the sea.
You mentioned earlier that the owners of the Zong, the Gregsons, they were based in Liverpool, and that was quite a centre for the slave trade at this time, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, we know that Liverpool is one of the most important ports. It's a major port, and as such, it's the centre of the trade. But there are other ports too. It's not just a Liverpool story. Bristol is another major centre, and also smaller ports and dockyards too. The dockyards in London are part and parcel of this global trade. So are smaller centres like Plymouth. It's not in any way a regional story. It's a national and it's an international story. One of the reasons that British ships were so involved in this trade and are responsible for so much of the transportation of people around the world is because fundamentally it was incredibly financially lucrative. The profits to be made were substantial, and one of the ways in which scholars try and recover some of these stories, because it is almost impossible to find the voices of the people who were moved around on the ships, but is to follow the money. So, where are the fortunes? Where did those fortunes come from? How did people fund their estates? How did cities, become buoyant financially? That the financial story often takes us back to those ships and that shipping.
And that financial aspect is really important to the Zong story in particular, doesn't it? It helps us understand what was going on, because at the heart of this is greed, profit, and financial motivation. Yeah,
absolutely. And actually one of the reasons we know about the story of the Zong and we know what happened on board that ship is because the owners of the ship were chasing the financial profits at the same time, and the events that unfolded at sea in those few days become the subject of a court case in England that's actually a case around financial aspects of the trade rather than actually the human aspects.
So to pick back up on the story, obviously this happened far out at sea. It was away from witnesses, and the logbook that recorded the events we've discussed disappeared, mysteriously or conveniently, however you want to think of it. So what we've heard so far, where does that come from?
Well, actually, crucially, the information that we do have about the Zong comes from the crew when they return to England. What we don't have is any of the testimonies of their enslaved victims or the other people who are on board that ship. But the main reason we know about really the atrocity that took place at sea at the time is because when the ship returns, the ship's owners actually attempt to make an insurance claim for the deaths of those enslaved Africans who they consider to be, and I use quotation marks, lost cargo.
Well, let's pause for a moment here, because I think when you said there was going to be a court case, most people would assume it was to hold people responsible for these mass killings. But you're suggesting actually it was the people who had thrown these enslaved people overboard who initiated the case, the people that we would today consider the perpetrators, not the victims.
Yeah, that's right. It comes to court because what the owners want to do is claim insurance for the loss of their cargo, which is their terminology, not ours. So for each of those individuals whose lives were lost at sea, who'd been thrown overboard by the crew, the ship's owners want to make a claim to the insurance company because all ships' contents and goods are insured, because shipping is an inherently risky business and there's a huge amount of money at stake. So there is an insurance system that operates in London to underwrite those routes and that shipping trade. And this ship is insured, as all are, and its cargo has been insured. So the ship's owners have obviously realised some of the profits they anticipated when it did dock in Jamaica, but what they want to do is make a claim for the lives that have been lost at sea. So they approached the insurance company saying that a number of their enslaved passengers have lost their lives at sea, asking for the insurance. Initially, the insurance company contests the claim, and because it's contested by the insurance company, the ship's owners are so believing of their right to repayment that they take the insurance company to court to try and force them to pay up. And that's when the details of the Zong become apparent.
And to make it very clear, this isn't some kind of life insurance policy. This is insurance premised on the idea that the people thrown overboard, they were not people, they were cargo, they were goods.
Yes, that's right. The contents of the ship are insured as if it was bales of cotton, coffee, rum, firearms, and people. So
how exactly did this insurance claim, or would this insurance claim have worked?
So insurance for shipping was slightly complicated in that it had certain caveats, and it specified that insurance would only be paid in certain circumstances, and those circumstances were sort of broadly termed as losses incurred because of the perils of the sea. So for instance, in the case of enslaved people, they weren't necessarily insured against death from disease or other natural causes, but a ship's contents, including its enslaved passengers, was insured against things like needing to throw cargo overboard in order to lighten a load, in terms of protecting the ship's progress in some way, protecting the crew against attack, and other kind of inherent risks associated with the moment of shipping. So the insurance didn't cover all eventualities, it only covered some eventualities, and that is a really important element of the insurance for the trial that then subsequently follows.
How so? What was at play there?
So basically it becomes beholden on the part of the person making the claim to prove that the losses happened in a way that was covered by the insurance. So you'll remember, for example, that the crew made a claim that the Zong had run out of drinking water. And that is important because associated with that is the suggestion that the loss of the enslaved lives, the murdering of people by throwing them overboard, was a necessary act because otherwise there wasn't enough water to go round. The crew had to be kept alive. As many of the enslaved passengers as possible had to be kept alive. So there's no other way to describe it as other than, the claimants in the case, the owners of the ship, wanted to present the loss of human life on board the Zong as actually a necessity, an unavoidable necessity due to the nature of the business of shipping.
It's quite extraordinary that they were willing to say so openly that these people had been murdered. Yes, we murdered them, but essentially what they're saying is we had to do it. I mean, you can't imagine this happening today, but it tells us something a bit about the climate of the time and attitudes towards slavery and the transatlantic slave trade.
It's really important to be aware that when the story of the Zong first comes into kind of public awareness or becomes within the historical record, it is because it is approached as a financial matter, a matter of insurance, of possible insurance fraud. Is somebody trying to claim insurance when they're not due insurance? And actually a story of human life and morality isn't really associated with it at that first moment. So, it's kind of remarkable to us that the ship's owners would even be making this case. They are pursuing a financial reward for the acts that have taken place at sea. But it is, at the beginning, a story of insurance and finance.
And it seems barbaric to us to reduce those human lives down to a question of pounds and pence, but that is exactly what's happening here. So in that claim, were the owners of the Zong successful in their insurance claim?
Well, so yes, at first they were. Initially, the insurance company is required to pay to make good on the insurance cover that they had promised. And they were made to pay out at a cost of £30 per person who died. That sum is decided on the basis of the average cost of each person who was sold in Jamaica when the ship arrived.
So each life is reduced to £30, and the idea is that the owners of the Zong would get a payout for every person murdered by their crew on their vessel.
That's right. But that's not the end of the story. The insurance company are unwilling to pay out. And again, not on the basis of any question of morality or the idea that somebody's life could be computed in this way, but simply on the assumption that maybe what happened on board the ship isn't quite as the crew is saying, and that there's some kind of fraud or manipulation, and that the insurance company are being required to pay up when they believe they shouldn't. So the appeal that the insurance company makes, again, is not based on humanity or morality, but it is based on finance. They appeal the decision, and so then another court case ensues. This one is presided over by Lord Chief Justice Mansfield, and it begins to get a little bit more attention.
And did this appeal shed any more light on what exactly happened on the Zong?
Well, yes. I mean, so more details of the ship's story and what was happening on board the Zong do come to light in the course of the next stage of this case. And, it's still being discussed and written about in terms of insurance and the economic infrastructure that's underpinning the trade. What becomes apparent in the course of these further investigations is that it's a very small and very inexperienced crew who are on board the Zong, and they make actually a number of significant navigational errors, which means that the ship's journey was taking much longer than it should. So there's a suggestion inherent in that the ship's captain is somehow negligent. He is not fulfilling his proper responsibility to get the ship as promptly as possible from point A to point B using his skill and experience. That through their own errors and misjudgments and miscalculations, the ship has been going on a longer route, and that's the cause of the loss of supplies, which they're then stating as the reason for their actions. So at the outset of this particular element of the case, there's a suggestion that the captain's negligence is responsible for what's happening on board the ship and why it is becalmed off the coast of Jamaica for a while. Those deficiencies would not be recoverable through insurance because the shortage of supplies is the fault of the crew. Also, in the course of this particular element of the case, there begins to become significant doubt that is cast over the crew's original suggestion that at the heart of their actions was a shortage of water, that critical supply, because it was discovered in the court that there had actually been moments of heavy rainfall during these days at sea. And certainly that heavy rainfall had come sort of in the middle of this moment of slaughter. So heavy rainfall is known to have fallen certainly before the third set of murders took place. So there seems to have been a possibility there for the crew to have made a different set of decisions. Doubt is cast on their actions, on their experience, on their own responsibility, and also the decisions and the timings of the decisions that they took. There's also a suggestion in the case that they weren't just throwing anybody overboard, that they were actually predominantly selecting women and children for these absolutely horrific days of murder. And the suggestion there is that because those passengers would not have secured such a high price once they got to the shores of Jamaica. So it begins to appear to be a set of strategic decisions based on profit, not decisions based on necessity or survival or perils of the sea in its 18th century terminology, but actually a purposeful, strategic and, truly horrific set of decisions that are to do with the bottom line.
So what was the outcome of this appeal? Who did the Lord Chief Justice find in favour of?
Well, it seems, as all of these details come to light, that the idea that the ship's owner should receive insurance payouts is just completely unfounded. But also what happens is that the case comes to the awareness of some key abolitionists at the time who were beginning to spearhead a new and growing abolition movement. So Eleuda Aquilano first hears of the case and he brings it to the attention of campaigner Granville Sharp. And Granville Sharp then really begins quite an impassionate campaign to raise awareness of what is happening, where this story of murder can come to be discussed and treated as one of insurance fraud. And through his letters and campaigns and writings and those of Aquilano, this story becomes transformed, actually, from one of money and profit to being the story of morality and murder. And Granville Sharp argues that the ship's owners and the ship's crew should be tried for murder, that is the case at the heart of this. He's unfortunately not successful in that. Nobody is ever prosecuted for these crimes, but the story is written again in a new way, and that's one of the reasons why we know about it, because of the actions of those abolition campaigners too. Otherwise, it might have just been buried in the court records of insurance cases, and who reads all of those really all of the time? So yes, they do succeed in bringing it to attention.
Can you tell us a bit more about the aftermath of this and the response of campaigners and abolitionists?
Well, clearly some people reacted as we would, to see this as an absolute horror that has unfolded and one that should not go unnoticed. And, abolitionists were scandalised. There was a sense in which if courts could treat mass murder in the slave trade as just another business transaction, then, how can that possibly be morally upheld? And so they protested that, quite rightly, that enslaved people should be treated as humans, not as goods, that they're not just a cargo that could be thrown aside in the same way that you could jettison other goods off a ship, that this was human life, and that the Zong case was not just one of insurance fraud or misdemeanour, but of murder, and that the crew should be tried for murder. And so they bring to bear a moral story associated with it, which is one that I think we would more recognise today.
But was this view, the view of the abolitionists, was that shared by the wider British public?
I think we should be cautious about presuming this brings just some moment of dramatic change, because, it's easy with the benefit of hindsight to link, one particular event to a sequence of results. But actually, the abolition movement takes a long time after this. Yes, it's used by Granville Sharp as a way to try and frame a language around the slave trade, but it's not as though everything suddenly changes. It's part of a much bigger campaign that takes, far more years ahead. And actually, you would think that a case like this would be in all of the kinds of newspapers or newsworthy in some way, but actually those sorts of contemporary records are really very quiet on the Zong. The Zong story lives in these court papers, and then also in the papers of Granville Sharp and Equiano and other abolitionists who are writing to their contacts, who are trying to then, generate lobbying campaigns and pressure groups. It's not a sort of public-facing scandal in the way that we might presume.
And that silence probably tells us quite a lot about public attitudes towards the slave trade at the time.
Yeah, certainly. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that at the very start of the story, the ship's owners felt that pursuing an insurance claim was a right and proper and unremarkable thing to do. That is really kind of at the heart of the story. And, we know that there's plenty of people who didn't share the same kind of outrage that the abolitionists expressed. There were a whole range of views. And so, for instance, Ellie, I don't know if you want to read this statement that was actually made at the time by Britain's Solicitor General, Justice John Lee.
So he's quite an eminent person then in the legal profession. And he said about this case, "What is this claim that human people have been thrown overboard? This is a case of chattels or goods. It is madness to accuse these well-serving, honourable men of murder. They acted out of necessity and in the most appropriate manner for the cause. The late Captain Collingwood acted in the interest of his ship to protect the safety of his crew. To question the judgment of an experienced, well-travelled captain held in the highest regard is one of folly, especially when talking of slaves. The case is the same as if wood had been thrown overboard." I mean, that's quite shocking to read, especially that last line, "the case is the same as if wood had been thrown overboard," and making that statement publicly. Clearly, you would think that if you're willing to do that, you believe people are going to agree with you.
Yeah, and it's a chilling reminder, isn't it, of how much work has to be done between this moment of the Zong and, the eventual kind of movement for abolition to change that perception. The idea that there could be a statement of this nature where they're questioning the suggestion that this is a story of human people, that there's a kind of frowning of the idea that a captain's choices could be questioned, that his absolute authority should somehow be even challenged, is so far from where we would hope people would have got to fairly quickly. It is just a reminder, a very brutal and chilling reminder of what the moral compass is at the time.
You've alluded to the fact that this wasn't some instant watershed moment, but if we are to place it in the wider timeline of the abolition of slavery, what happened next? How long did it take for, legislation to come into play?
We know about the Zong because abolitionists made sure we knew about the Zong. So they used the court case to try and increase public awareness of the atrocities of the trade, and also to bolster a campaign both within Parliament and the public for abolition. So it is possible, if you wanted to draw a line that starts with the Zong massacre and then the insurance cases that emerge in 1783 when the ship returns to England, And then we have the founding of the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1787, which suggests some moral shift in terms of public discourse around the slave trade. And then this is followed in 1788 by the first Slave Trade Act, which is the very first piece of legislation in Britain to try and regulate the slave trade. It's then followed by a further act in 1807, which specifically prohibits the transatlantic slave trade. And then eventually the trade is abolished in most British colonies with the enactment of the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. So, in the decades that follow Zong, we do see some steps which lead to abolition.
So finally, Hannah, what do you think that this scandal of the Zong massacre can tell us about the Georgian age?
Well, it's a dark and difficult history. But it's really important that we talk about this 18th century world. The story of the Zong is so brutal and horrific to discuss. It makes you think about that horrible loss of life for what end. But the Zong was carrying 400 people. 130 lost their lives. But there were millions. It was just a small proportion of the millions of people who were enslaved and forcibly removed from their homes, to work on these plantations. So it is a tip of the iceberg in terms of what the story really is. It's such a big and horrific story, but also such a small one in terms of the scale of what was actually happening at the time. And I suppose one thing as well the Zong reminds us of is that what about all of those stories that weren't told and maybe can't ever be told? How many other ships were there like the Zong who were engaged in these kinds of practices? The crew don't seem to have regarded it as particularly unusual or abhorrent or an anomaly. So what are those other stories? We won't ever reach them, but we should think about them.